So one Saturday in September, this past September, sitting in my office, Saturday afternoon, the kids are all napping, wonderful, beautiful, working away. I hear a lawnmower, which is not a surprise. People mow their lawns on Saturdays, of course. But as I'm working away, I'm thinking to myself, it sounds like my yard. It sounds like somebody's mowing my lawn. And so I go to the window and I look out, and there's Kristen, 9 months pregnant, out mowing the lawn. And it wasn't just that she was mowing the lawn, it was what she was wearing. She was wearing red rubber boots, a skirt, and a tank top. And pregnant, she's just hanging out there, and my jaw almost hit the floor. I was like, oh, a Saturday, the neighbors are going to see this. I ran out to her, honey, what are you doing? She's like, I'm mowing the lawn. I'm like, you can't do that. What are the neighbors going to think of me? She's like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, it's my job to mow the lawn. She's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, I don't know. I just feel like it's my job to mow the lawn, especially given your current condition. And she sort of brushed me off. It's no big deal. But I was absolutely mortified. You could see the neighbors sort of scowling at me. Look at this deadbeat husband. He's got his 9-month pregnant wife out mowing the lawn. You know, it's a weird thing because I consider myself egalitarian, and yet there are these moments where I find myself sort of, I get these gender role things, ideas in my mind, and I'm like, that feels like I should be doing that. Now, some of you are probably thinking, who cares about gender roles? Yes, you should have been mowing your lawn. 9-month pregnant woman doing that doesn't seem right. But gender is such a weird thing, isn't it? I mean, consider this week for Canada, eh? What a big week. I'm not sure if I just didn't care enough before, but I've never seen this kind of media coverage given to a new prime minister and the choosing of his cabinet. I mean, it's fascinating stuff. But of course, what's also strange to me is that for the first time that I can remember personally, people actually seem to care who's in cabinet. It's sort of odd, don't you think? Since when have Canadians ever cared, ever even known the name of a person in cabinet? But now that half of the cabinet is made up of women, suddenly everyone seems interested and is wondering about qualifications. Is everyone qualified? Odd stuff. It seems gender has been on everyone's mind this week as our new government has been sworn in, which makes it a sort of perfect week to talk about gender here, doesn't it? I'll be honest, I have always thought talking about gender is like just a horrible idea. In my experience, focusing on differences, I think it can be polarizing. I think we can end up with caricature portraits of what it means to be male and female, and yet this is exactly where our series is taking us this morning. So let's dive into some age-old questions. Are men and women different? Are we born different, or has culture conditioned us just to think so? As we study the higher path of love that Jesus calls us to, we're going to explore these questions this morning, and I'll just qualify here. I'm taking the scenic route this morning, and you might be wondering, are we lost, Brad, on the way? Bear with me. We're taking a scenic route. There is an end goal. I'm heading somewhere, but I hope you will travel with me here. I remember when Kristen and I were newly engaged, and then when we were newly married, it seemed like everyone had a book they wanted us to read about marriage and relationships. Now, I'm not sure if it was that we really needed it, if people thought, wow, these people need some advice. I don't know. Everyone seemed to be giving us books, pastors, friends, everyone, you should read this book. It'll be really helpful. And since then, of course, in doing my own premarital counseling with some people, I've read so many books about relationships and marriage, and they sort of span these odd sort of trajectory. Like you'll get certain things like men are like waffles, women are like spaghetti, like fairly predictable, this is how men and women are. And then there's really fascinating stuff like one I recently read, Spouseonomics, which is you should approach relationships through the eyes of economics. And it's a really actually fascinating read. But there's all these sort of different books out there. And the interesting thing to me is the vast majority of them, they simply work from this premise. Men and women are different. And so if you want your relationship to work, learn and understand those differences so that you can meet the needs of your partner more adequately. If Kristen can learn about my needs, I can learn about her needs, then we'll understand each other, we can be better equipped for our relationship. And these books are everywhere. In Chapters, Amazon, libraries, and church libraries. Many of them simply work off the fundamental principle men and women have different relational needs. The key to a great relationship, realizing that, moving to meet those needs. Which is fair enough. There's some truth here. For instance, study after study replicated across cultures show the following tendencies in men and women. Now, a tendency is just that, a tendency. So hear me out here. Of course, there are outliers. Of course, people experience these tendencies to varying degrees. And of course, you can shake off these tendencies. No one's questioning that. But again, study after study across cultures show the following tendencies. So for men, more sexualized, more likely to engage in things like masturbation, casual sex. Second, stimulated to a significant degree through visual cues. Third, less interested in a mate's ability to acquire resources. Women, of course, it seems to go the opposite. Less sexualized, less interested, less prone to engage in casual sex, stimulated by emotional or relational cues, more interested in a mate's ability to acquire resources. Now, I'm sure none of these are a huge surprise. But the odd thing to me is this. Many books and primers on relationships, they start here. And so in religious circles, it's often, well, that's just the way we're created. So let's craft strategies to help us sort of navigate our differences. Or outside faith circles, it can be, well, whether it's social conditioning or human nature, we're not quite sure. It doesn't matter, though. Here's the way things are. Let's simply work with it, work around it. As you know, in this series, I'm trying to bring evolutionary psychology into dialogue with us as we work along. And the interesting thing to me is that in evolutionary psychology, what they want to do is they want to back up and ask a very different question. They don't want to start with that. They want to back up and ask, why are there these differences? And how it answers this question is captivating to me. The best way to illustrate the answer of gender differences is to use the concept of minimal parental investment, or MPI. The theory works this way. It starts with a question. What is the minimum investment males and females need to produce offspring? Remember, of course, in evolution's mind, it's all about creating offspring. The answer to this question is the reason, according to evolutionary psychology, as to why men and women have very different sexual, psychological tendencies. So let's explore these briefly, because the answer to this question lies in the fact that for women, their minimal parental investment is way, way higher than men. Let me show you what I mean by way of a few contrasts. Let's talk about value, risk, and time involved in creating a child in the ancestral environment, so we're talking 10,000 plus years ago. First question. What is the risk the male and female face if impregnation occurs? The male? None. Zero. No risk at all. The female? Her very life. Especially 10,000 years ago. No hospitals, nothing. She could die. Female MPI trumps male MPI. Okay, next question. What is the relative value of male-female reproductive cells? Males, well, sperm are produced in the billions every day across our entire lifespan. You could say this, sperm is a vast and renewable resource. What about women? Eggs are limited. About 480 are released across their lifespan, one each month. So you could say it's a finite and precious resource. Last question. What is the minimum amount of time men and women must invest in order to produce a viable offspring? For men, 20 minutes. Okay, all right. Okay. Fair enough, honey. 10 minutes men need to... Okay. get back to reality here. Okay. 2 to 5 minutes. That's what a man needs to produce viable offspring. That's the average length of a commercial break. What about a woman? A female, it's 10 months. Female MPI greatly trumps male MPI. You start to get the point, right? To produce offspring, which is the goal in evolutionary terms, a woman's investment is astronomically higher than a man's. The burden is placed squarely on her shoulders. Because of this, so goes the theory, our sexual psychologies evolve to reflect our levels of investment in parenting. Think about it. In an ancestral environment, when a woman has sex with a man, she risks everything. She's spending her 1 egg a month on him, investing 10 months of her life. If impregnation occurs, she risks her very life at childbirth. From evolution's point of view, sex for a woman is just downright scary. It's a matter of life and death. For a man, time investment is minimal. His sperm can be wasted. He's literally got millions to spare. Doesn't have to give birth to the child. Sex is basically risk-free pleasure. Now, if you can buy this, the very different burdens placed on men and women throughout our history have shaped our sexual psychologies, shaped the sexual tendencies of genders. How so? You could sum it up simplistically this way. Females evolved what you would call a picky sexual psychology. This picky psychology manifests itself in 2 ways. First, a woman has a tendency to be less open to casual sexual encounters. Second, given the burden, given the cost with a sexual encounter, females have a tendency to be attracted to high investment mates. Mates that will love them, ability to support them, commit to them long term. Now, for males, there's no risk for casual sex. So males have a tendency to be much more sexualized. But here's the rub. Because a female is much more picky, the marketplace becomes highly restricted and competitive. And so if he's going to get his genes into the gene pool, he's going to need to focus on one or a few women with high reproductive potential. Now, how do you tell that in the ancestral environment? Well, reproduction quality was associated with youth and genetic quality. The only way to tell that was through the eyes, through the visual system. And voila, the male sexual psychology evolved in response to these particular visual cues. Now, like I've said, this whole series, I'm only bringing along evolutionary psychology as a dialogue partner. Believe it or not, it doesn't matter to me. But even if you don't, you got to admit it's kind of a clever little theory. It's a fascinating explanation for why we see different tendencies in men and women. And even if you don't buy this, let me give you one quick example I think that lends some credence to this theory. Consider men and porn. Think about it. There is an entire industry that's built around this assumption. Men have a heightened visual cue system. Porn, whatever you want to make of it, is really a bet. It's a bet hedged around evolutionary psychology's hunch that men are wired visually. Entire industry built around that, and from what I hear, they're not hard up financially. And again, the irony with all of this is, of course, this. Oftentimes, the ones who insist most that men and women have innate differences happen to be the ones who are anti-Darwin, anti-evolution. Curious phenomenon, because differences between genders seem to be, in this theory, an evolutionary adaptation. So there's the theory. But here's my guess. My guess is that after hearing this theory, this understanding of gender tendencies, most of us in this room are probably feeling one of 4 things. This is my guess. First, either you're just disinterested and you're thinking, I don't come to Nexus to hear about evolutionary psychology. When are we getting to Jesus in the Bible? Hold your horses. I'm going somewhere. We're getting there. Others of you are perhaps thinking, well, that was helpful. That was helpful. It maybe makes sense of my own experience. Perhaps as a male, you're thinking, oh, well, finally, I get it, why why I can't seem to shake this powerful attraction I have to visual cues. Or maybe if you're a woman, you're thinking, that makes sense. It makes sense to me now why I'm keenly interested in my partner being more emotionally invested in our relationship. Maybe this is helpful. But there are others of you who probably are feeling quite marginalized by this. If you are LGBTQ, you possibly look at this and think, well, okay, that might make sense of some of my tendencies, but it certainly doesn't make sense of my entire experience. All this does is make me feel marginalized further on the fringes. Or if you're a woman, maybe you're thinking, oh my goodness, this is incredibly depressing. Look at the burden life has placed on women. MPI highlights how easy it would be to take advantage of these tendencies. Or maybe there are those of you who have chosen not to have kids, or those of you who can't have kids, and you're thinking, oh, this just makes me feel awful. And some of you are probably just downright offended by it, in which case, I'm sorry, I'm simply bringing it into dialogue here, but perhaps you're offended. Maybe you're thinking, you know what, all this heteronormative talk, it drives me nuts. I hate being pigeonholed or told what my tendencies are. Fair enough. Because the reality is, I'm in the last three camps as well. I mean, for me, it's sort of helpful because my whole life, I just have this sexual drive. I mean, I'm attracted visually, and it's sort of like, I can't shake it. And yet, this is like, okay, well, maybe that helps explain it a little. But I also feel marginalized. If you remember those tendencies, right? Males are less interested in their partner's ability to require resources. Kristen is the breadwinner in our family. And so, I look at tendencies like this and I think, you know what, that makes me feel marginalized. This idea that somehow there's just what males think and how they act. I've never sort of quite felt like I fit the male stereotype. I'm also offended because on a certain level, I hate the idea that I'm somehow a prisoner to some sort of evolutionary process. I hate the idea that I would be a slave to my genes. And so I look at this theory, I'm like, Here's the thing. Regardless of what you think of gender tendencies, regardless of whether you think it's human nature or social construct, I actually don't think these tendencies are the problem. There's nothing inherently wrong with these tendencies. The conflicts and debates we experience so profoundly about gender, in my mind, at its root, it has little or nothing to do with these tendencies. In my mind, the real problem is this. These tendencies are used to exploit and manipulate others. We use tendencies to exploit and manipulate others. This is what has happened throughout history with gender tendencies. What has happened is because of our ancestry, because they've given us these tendencies, we've made them normative. And by making them normative, those with power have been able to manipulate and exploit these tendencies for personal gain, self-centered reasons. And the real issue in my mind is not that we might have these tendencies as men and women, but what the use of power is capable of doing with these tendencies. In our relationships, at homes, whether you're egalitarian or not, there's always that real temptation to take the tendencies of our partner and manipulate and exploit them. In our communities, in churches, it's very easy to take tendencies and manipulate, exploit them. In culture, it's the same way. We can take tendencies and use them to our advantage. And this is where Jesus enters the picture. What does Jesus say? What does Scripture say about gender and power? I want to start with a curious verse that I've always been like, I totally don't really get what Jesus is saying there, but I think I'm having a better understanding of it now. Curious verse, late in Jesus' life. So at this point, he's not very popular. He's just going to continue to make himself even less popular. Jesus says this, "Do not call anyone on earth Father, for you have one Father, and he's in heaven." On the surface, this passage, I think, looks like it's simply reinforcing gender roles, that God is a father, a male. But I think that's missing the point. Jesus statement, "Call no man father," was like a massive bomb, a massive critique and attack on his culture. Jesus is attacking here the power structure his society was built upon. It's very easy for us to forget just how patriarchal Jesus' society was. The men, the fathers, the patriarchs held the power. And into that context, Jesus says, "Call no man on earth father." I don't think Jesus is saying God's a man here. Jesus is attacking the patriarchal power structure of his day. He's sort of cutting it off at its knees. Jesus isn't making a statement about gender. He's making a statement about power. The issue is about power. It's always about power. We see Jesus elaborate on this theme in one of his other troubling and puzzling statements. He makes so many of them. Matthew 10:34. "Do not suppose that I've come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." Wait, what? Isn't Jesus supposed to be the nonviolent Prince of Peace? What's all this about swords and I've not come to bring peace? I think the following verses sort of illustrate what's going on. It all becomes clear. It said, "For I've come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household." What is going on? Notice all of these examples are those without power, children, against those with power, parents, men in a patriarchal society. I believe what's going on here is Jesus is attacking the patriarchal power structures embedded in first century Middle Eastern family structures. Jesus is bringing a sword, all right. He's saying his kingdom is going to upend and cut down every power structure we know. Because in Jesus' mind, the only real source of power is God, not systems that lord power over others. Jesus is showing us a new way, a higher way of love, a way that renounces power plays. I mean, just after this statement, he makes this claim, which we've revisited frequently here. "Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it. Whoever loses their life for my sake will find it." This is the key, in my mind, to the war that Jesus is waging. The cross is the sword. The way of the cross is the war, and yet it's so inverted and brilliant. I love it. Because in this battle, instead of grasping at power, instead of using power, what Jesus is saying is, our call is to lay down power, lay aside power, take up our cross. For me, in my mind, for those of us in the church, Jesus' call to the higher path of love, it isn't specifically about how we answer questions about gender. The real issue is how we exercise power. And discussions around gender roles, gender identity are oftentimes a cover for the real issue, which is often this: who's in charge and who gets to call the shots? Isn't this what we saw in politics this week? Whoa. What are you saying? Men aren't in charge? They're not calling the shots? It's always about this. Who's in charge? Who's calling the shots? And as we've seen, Jesus is so hostile to this sort of thing. And when jockeying for power happens within Jesus' church, well, Jesus sort of threatens to bring the sword, so to speak, metaphorically. When we as a community or as individuals are tempted to make power plays over others, whether it's based on gender or any other criteria, Jesus' approach is that there should be no peace. Conflict with power structures. The Christian way is the way of the cross. The greatest among us are the servants. The leaders are those who serve and submit. The leaders of us are the ones who should be washing feet. We seek to serve rather than be served. We seek to submit to others, not insist on our own way. That's how power looks in God's kingdom. Notice this Galatians passage, a very famous passage by the Apostle Paul. He's an early pioneer of the Christian faith, and he's talking about what community life looks like for the church, and he says this: "So in Christ Jesus, you are children of God through faith. For all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And again, this passage isn't specifically about gender roles, it's a passage about power. In all of these situations, Jews, of course, in the early church were trying to exert their power over Gentiles. Free people obviously had power over slaves. And of course, men in a patriarchal society had power over women. It's a power passage. And what Paul is saying is this: we don't play the power game inside the church. We don't do it. It's not part of our identity as a community. We don't recognize power structures here. We refuse to play by the rules of power that lord it over other people, that use power to manipulate, marginalize others. In the church, there's only one source of power authority, that's Christ. And what does this all look like for us practically here at Nexus? Well, I would say this. I believe the higher path of love Jesus calls us to means that we should seek to include and transcend gender tendencies. I don't think it means we need to ignore or pretend there aren't differences among us. No. I think what it means is that we take those differences and we transcend them. We learn from them, but we refuse to allow them to paint how we see others, how we treat others. I would say this: if an understanding of gender tendencies is going to help you make sense of yourself, or if it's going to help you become more compassionate, kind, understanding, loving to others, by all means. I could care less if you read Men Are From Mars, Woman from Venus. I don't care. If that's helpful to you and is going to make you a more loving person, go for it. But let us never, ever, ever use those tendencies or differences to exploit, marginalize others. If understanding gender tendencies helps, great. If not, then just throw it out. Throw it out. May we never, ever use those understandings to lord power over others. Let us never, both men and women, use gender tendencies to manipulate, marginalize, whether that's at home, in our workplaces, in our relationships, in our churches, our communities, the broader context of the world. For me, gender tendencies are fun to talk about. They're fun to explore, insofar as they help me understand myself, maybe others. But so often, too often, discussions are really about power. And it easily becomes a weapon of oppression. Here's the reality as I close. The power dynamics surrounding gender tendencies have a long, long history of causing hurt and pain for many, many people. I think specifically of those in the LGBTQ community, women, visible minorities, many others. Power dynamics have caused untold amounts of pain and harm. It's those affected here negatively by those uses of power I want to offer an apology. I am so sorry for the way the use of power, whether it's in our homes, our churches, our culture at large, I'm very sorry for the pain that it has caused. With all my heart, with all my conviction, I do not believe that is the way of Jesus. I do not believe that's the way of the church. And I do not believe it's going to be the way that NEXUS operates. It's not to be the way of NEXUS either. And so I want to assure you, we have an amazing leadership team here at NEXUS. Every time we meet, we discuss, we pray for this community, and we have a leadership team that is committed to making sure that power dynamics that cause oppression, manipulation, marginalization, that they are minimized as much as possible within our community. Our earnest desire here is to be a caring community where everyone is respected and valued and loved and honored, regardless of our tendencies, regardless of whether people fit the norm, regardless of where we fit along the continuum. In a world that insists on the use of power, as Jesus has said, it will not be so with us.